Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. In this episode, we'll discuss the fourth Sunday after Epiphany, also known as Lectionary 4, which falls on January 31st this year. A couple content notifications for this episode. In our second reading, we talk about queerphobia, and in our gospel reading, we talk about mental illness.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Our deep dive for this episode is idolatry, which is a big word that I think needs a little bit of unpacking. So in our second reading, 1 Corinthians reading, Paul is talking about idolatry. Just a reminder for folks that the way that Kay and I approach Paul and the epistles is that Paul is a colleague. Maybe I do.
I approach him as a colleague too. It's just I'm thinking that we've been talking to Paul an awful lot lately, and maybe that's partly because he's a colleague.
Yes. And sometimes you gotta talk to colleagues that you disagree with a lot. So we view Paul as a colleague. He is, in this passage, clearly not a fan of other religions or other faiths. And the thing about that is he has a particular agenda. He's trying to get the word out about Jesus and trying to recruit folks to be followers of the way, to follow Jesus. And this is not how Jesus lived his life. Jesus interacted with people who weren't Jewish all the time. We have stories of him healing the centurion's quote-unquote slave. We have stories of him interacting with Gentiles, with Samaritans, with all people of all sorts of different beliefs. And he doesn't require them to confess their faith in him in order to be healed, in order to receive anything from him. He sees them, he takes care of them, and they go on their way. And this also is a reminder, if you think back to Epiphany, where the Magi visit Jesus. They're from different religions. They come visit Jesus. They leave. They go back. They're not converted to Christianity or Judaism.
Right.
The relationships that they have with Jesus do probably change them, just as our relationships that we have with other people change them, right? The relationships I have with people of different faiths actually strengthen my faith, because then I get to think about my own faith and they get to think about their own faith, and we discover the places where we connect and we discover the places where we differ, and that's important.
And I don't know about you, Emily, but when it comes to talking about interfaith work or that sort of thing, one of the verses that a lot of people tend to quote at me is Jesus saying, "I am the way and the truth and the life," followed by, "People can only come to God through me." Depending on which translation you're using, that changes up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, Jesus does not ever specifically say, and people can only come to me, and therefore to God, through the Christian church. Yeah. That is not a thing that Jesus ever says.
Christian church, not actually in the Bible.
Right. Jesus can work through people, and we don't get to say who Jesus is working through. We don't get to say who is coming to God, or where Jesus is and where Jesus is not. That is not a role that's been given to us.
Mm-hmm.
And also, historically, we've done that, and we've done terrible things, so let's avoid that too.
Yeah, the Christian church is great at doing terrible things to people of other faiths. That is part of our history, and that needs to be acknowledged and repented of.
Yeah. So, while we are basically saying that you can disagree with people and still treat them with respect, which is true, I think because, especially in America, we've been having that conversation a lot as a way to avoid repentance around recent events. We also need to point out that one way that you can treat your interfaith relationships and your views of other faiths is by asking yourself, is anybody getting hurt in this situation? Because that's also how we can other people that we disagree with about other things. Like when we're asking ourselves, can I disagree with this person and still respect them, one of the questions I ask myself is this person hurting someone? And if the answer is no, then yeah, sure. They can have any thoughts about, what college someone should have gone to that they want. No one's getting hurt. That's fine. If the answer is yes, then things get a little bit more complicated. So there are certainly religious groups or groups that call themselves religious in this world that are absolutely hurting people. And we still need to acknowledge that and try to help those people. But that doesn't mean that we can't also have good interfaith relationships with other religions that aren't.
Yeah, the thing that also makes me think of is Ibu Patel of the Interfaith Youth Corps. I think it's a quote from him, but I might be misquoting. Talked about, he said, the quote is something along the lines of, I have more in common with moderates of other traditions than I do with extremists of my own tradition.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, and I think that's part of it, right? That's part of when we have a responsibility to, particularly as white Christians right now, we have a responsibility to very clearly denounce the white Christian nationalism and fascism that is trying to impede the functioning of our democracy.
Yes, and for that matter, the functioning of our church.
Yeah, and the places that we have in common, or the places that we can work with other people. It's actually there's great interfaith coalitions that are built by people who have shared values, because a lot of our faith traditions share common values of care for the community, for each other. That's not countered by the fact that we have different faiths, but in fact strengthened, because it's a greater witness when people who have kind of core differences about certain things come together.
Yes. And it reminds me of a fictional reference, actually.
Oh, yeah?
West Wing. Just after 9/11 happened, West Wing did a special episode that was sort of out of the timeline. And it involved Josh Lyman talking to a group of high school students, which always seems like a dangerous proposition.
Always a bad idea.
Like, Josh talking to anyone where it wasn't scripted out in advance, weird things can happen. But at one point, he offers them a blank is to blank as blank is to blank.
An analogy?
Yes, thank you. An analogy. And the one he puts up on the board is Islamic extremists, people who commit violence in the name of Islam, are to Islam as blank is to Christianity. What's the blank?
The KKK.
Yeah. And here we are again, 20 years later, living through all that again.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that many faiths have in common is that people try to do terrible things in the name of that faith. And I think that those of us who aren't doing terrible things in the name of our faith, whatever that faith is, can unite together to, convince the people who are doing the terrible things to please stop doing that.
Mm-hmm. So the other piece that I want to dive into a little bit on this concept of idolatry and of God is a theological nerdery that I have from my days in college, actually. Dr. Vonda Deifeldt, who's amazing, and everyone should try to read her books and study under her if they go to Luther College. Assigned for one of our Christian theology class, assigned The Dynamics of Faith by Paul Tillich. And it's a fantastic book. But part of what Tillich talks about, and for context, Tillich is a white Christian theologian, I think in the time period of World War II. He was from Germany, but not a Nazi. So his context is both Nazi Germany and the United States. Tillich talked about God as the ultimate concern. And I really liked that idea. And that is a concept of idolatry that I think makes more sense for us to talk about and to think about when we think about idolatry. So it's not whether or not you espouse Christian beliefs, but instead, what is your ultimate concern? So if my ultimate concern is having enough money or having a ton of money, then that becomes God for me, and that would be idolatry. And I think it gets a little tricky because there's a certain extent to which ultimate concern, if you're living in poverty.
Yeah, survival is not quite the same thing.
Yeah, survival is not what we're talking about. We're talking about beyond survival.
Wanting to have 8 yachts and 14 houses.
Yeah.
Which is a thing people do.
Yeah. So wanting to have 8 yachts and 14 houses, probably your ultimate concern has to do with wealth and the accumulation of wealth.
Yeah.
And so then that becomes your God. And in that sense, it would be idolatry. It would be a false God. It would be a God that is not the sourcing ground of all being and life.
Right.
And that, we'll get into this actually a little bit, I think, in our deep dive for our next episode. But if your ultimate concern is making sure that your neighbor has enough to eat, that you're caring for the whole community, that there is justice and there is love, those are things that are of God, and those are things that are God, right? Where we think about God as love and justice. And so then that's a different kind of ultimate concern. But I find that really helpful in my own check-ins with myself, but also in thinking about, like, what does it mean when Paul says idolatry is bad? Well, if we think about that as putting ourselves before others, or concerning ourselves with having that 15th yacht, then that's probably what Paul is talking about. And we've got plenty of idolatry happening in this pandemic, as we see so many billionaires who have more money than they did before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But that's where we can point to what is idolatry in a way that is helpful in our context.
Yeah. Our first reading for this episode is from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. As God leads the Israelites into the promised land, after several years of traveling through the wilderness, Moses tells the people that God will continue to speak to them through prophets, who hold a tremendous responsibility.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage was what the prophets do or don't or should or shouldn't say. So God is talking about the prophets and saying, like, anyone who doesn't heed the words of the prophets, but also any prophet who speaks in God's name and doesn't say the right thing, those sorts of things. And it got me thinking about the Matrix, and the Oracle is like the prophet in the Matrix.
Yes.
And she doesn't always tell the truth, which I think is fascinating. She, like, at one point she tells Neo that he's not the one.
Well, she allows him to come to that conclusion.
Well, okay, yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she, whether or not
but she does, like, flat out lie at least once, if I remember right.
Yeah.
So.
She's not always truthful about what she says, but she does, and I think, I don't know who says this, but she says what the person needs to hear.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about prophets. Yes, a lot of it is telling the truth, but a lot of it is also saying what people need to hear in order for the bigger message to get through or to be conveyed. And I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
In the context of God being like, you have to say what I tell you to say. And yeah. Speaking of prophets, as we dive into this passage, in verse 15, we hear that the becoming one, your God, will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses talking, from among your own people. And I think about that, and I always think of Rey in Star Wars up until the final episode. So I will full well admit I do not like the final episode. I am not a fan of. Part of what I loved about Rey was that she was an ordinary person. She didn't have the magical lineage of the Skywalkers or anybody else. She was a person raised up from among the people and became this prophet, became the one that would lead them to something new and to that new hope and the new possibilities for how to be as a, like, universe. And yes, I know the last movie ruined it. I'm just choosing not to believe what they say in the last movie.
That is absolutely your right as a fan.
Yes.
Goodness knows, I was just talking about this the other day, there are plenty of fictional universes where certain things just did not happen. Two of my favorite examples are the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Star Trek Voyager. In the Marvel Cinematic Universe, all of the superheroes are still, living happily together and fighting crime, or whatever. And in Star Trek Voyager, the last episode simply did not happen. Like, they got home okay, but, that last episode with all of the very weird characterization changes, just completely unnecessary. We'll ignore that.
Nice. The other option we could compare it to also is Katniss, who is, in fact, of the people.
Yes.
But I like Rey.
Yeah.
I choose to maintain Rey's peopleness.
In verse 16, we hear, "This is what you requested of the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said, 'If I hear the voice of the Lord my God any more, or ever again see this great fire, I will die.'" So that all sounds a little melodramatic, but to be fair, if God is speaking directly to you, I imagine that might be feeling a little melodramatic. Like, that must be a very powerful experience, is how I'm taking this verse. So, what I take out of this verse is that if a style of communication isn't working for you, it is perfectly okay to ask to change it. It sounds like that's what the Israelites did. The Israelites were being spoken to directly by God. That was a little bit too verklempt of an experience for them. They needed something a little bit more ordinary, a little less, giant fire following them around thing. I can see that. That's okay. And so they asked to change it. Just give us a person to talk to, please, because this is getting way too overdramatic for us. And this reminds me of, in the TV show Person of Interest, the characters John and Root. Yes, I know that's an unusual name. Both John and Root work with the Machine, which is a surveillance supercomputer. Yes, it is supposed to sound that creepy. This is the good surveillance supercomputer in that universe, as opposed to the bad surveillance supercomputer, which is a whole separate set of stories.
Is there such a thing as a good surveillance supercomputer?
That's kind of part of the question of the series, yeah.
Okay.
That's an ongoing thing. But both John and Root work with the Machine because at that point, basically working with it is better than ignoring its existence because they're saving lives. But they have very different styles of interacting with the Machine. For Root, part of her relationship with the Machine is that she almost treats the Machine like a person. Like, she chats with it, she expects answers more often. There's a real sense of communication that's going both ways. Whereas John is much more goal-oriented, focuses on what the topic of the day is, and treats the Machine like a machine. They have different styles of communication, but ultimately speaking, it works for both of them. So.
Fascinating. I have never seen that show. I don't know that I ever will, but
it asks some interesting questions. I mean, I'm not saying it's... I almost never say that something is the perfect example of television, but they did an okay job with the whole ongoing conversation of, so, like, is this right or not? Or yes, they're saving lives, but yes, it's still creepy. So they did a nice balance of it.
Nice. In verse 19, God says, "Anyone who does not heed the words that the prophet shall speak in my name, I myself will hold accountable." And I was thinking about accountability, and it definitely happens in the West Wing. The one that came to mind most readily was the very, very beginning pilot episode where Josh Lyman says stuff that he shouldn't about the conservative white Christian lady on TV. And he faces accountability for what he said. And it's complicated by politics and political dynamics and blah, blah, blah. But the West Wing gives me comfort a lot of the time because, at least in fictional politics, there's still accountability.
Yes.
No matter what is currently going on in our current politics, where there is no accountability for fascism.
Yeah. Well, we're working on it, I hope.
Yeah, here's hoping. But yay, accountability.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I love Josh's character is because he is absolutely the guy who says what he's thinking when he shouldn't, which is absolutely something I've been known to do here and there. And I actually remember the line he got in trouble for, which is, "Lady, the God you pray to is getting indicted for tax fraud." And it makes a lot more sense in context, yes. Once the context of that comment is more fully explained, you get why he said it, but he still shouldn't have. So
yeah.
In verse 20, we hear, "But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name," God's name, "a word that I have not commanded the prophet to speak, that prophet shall die." Now, getting struck dead by God these days seems to happen a lot less often than it did in the Bible. Yay. Thanks, God. Good plan. But that doesn't mean that saying things in God's name that aren't actually from God doesn't have consequences. Doing that does have consequences. Now, to be honest with you, I really can't enjoy a lot of fiction that depicts clergy at all anymore, because there has just been so much of it that has been terrible.
Oh my gosh.
And to be honest, I'm not even talking about, like, clergy that are depicted as being horrible people, so much as I'm talking about just the complete lack of fact-checking.
Yeah.
Like, I have opinions and I can go for days, so I'm not going to. Just do some research, people. It's not hard. But one of the depictions of clergy in fiction that I have enjoyed is, oddly enough, the movie Chocolat, in which there is a new young Catholic priest in town, in a small village, and he spends the first several weeks of his time there, which is during Lent, basically preaching sermons that have been written or rewritten by the town mayor. Because of interpersonal politics, the mayor is insisting he really doesn't feel like he can get out of it. And the thing about these sermons that he's preaching are that they don't have any gospel to them at all. And as the weeks go by, the community and the mayor both get more and more toxic and more miserable, until Easter happens, and the mayor basically has a breakdown, which involves chocolate, weirdly enough. And the priest is finally free to truly preach the gospel unhindered for the first time, and also has absolutely nothing written down, because of course he doesn't have a script from the mayor, and he just kind of has to wing it, which I think is, having to wing a Easter sermon is every pastor's worst nightmare.
Oh, I was going to say that also. I was going to say that it, like, feels pretty authentic to, like, what Mary had to do.
Yeah. He does a wonderful job, but the thing about Easter is that there's so much pressure to do a good job for that one service, because so many people are there, that the whole concept still terrifies me. But he does a fantastic job, and it's also one of the best on-screen sermons I've ever seen to date. Frankly, because a lot of on-screen sermons I've seen have been terrible. Again, fact-checking, it's not hard. And after that, the community thrives, because the gospel has shown up, which is totally not the message of the movie. To be fair, this is not a particularly religious movie, although one of the focuses is religion. It's a lovely example of how what the local prophet or priest says does have an effect on the community.
Yeah. Our second reading for this Sunday is 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 through 13. Paul reminds followers of Christ that not only the substance, but also the appearance of their actions matter. New believers who are still learning about the faith might get the wrong impression by some actions. So one of the themes in this passage, as we alluded to a bit in our deep dive, is deities, other gods. And it made me think of Battlestar Galactica, which I'm still in the middle of, and I'm not sure how it ends, so don't hold me to anything. But at this point in Battlestar Galactica, the default for the communities that make up the colonies is polytheism. So they talk about the lords of Cobalt, and the monotheists are actually the weird ones. And there's like a weird thing with a Cylon that's monotheist, and I don't know if all the Cylons are or what, but so that is a connection that exists. And at the same time, like, at least from my perspective as a pastor / theology nerd, they don't really develop this. So it's just that, like, when they talk about God, they say, oh my gods, or lords of Cobalt, but when they talk about them, they talk about them all together. They don't talk about individual gods.
Interesting. Okay.
At least they haven't so far. And so I don't know if it's just a similar thing to what you were talking about, where, like, clearly religion is not the focus of this, except to the extent that it furthers the plot. But what would it look like if they actually developed, like, yes, the Geminis are the ones who are, like, hardcore religious folks, but, like, what if they actually developed some episodes where they explored the different lords of Cobalt and just explored the different gods and, like, why there are multiple gods? And
sure,
I don't know, I'd like more exploration of the theology of basically anything, but it would require fact checking, because I would not just, like, accept any old, this is the thing, the end.
No, for most people that grew up in a monotheist culture, writing about monotheism is hard enough, and goodness knows people have screwed that up regularly. Writing about polytheism when you grew up in a monotheist culture is a completely different ballgame and so much harder. So,
yeah. If they did do anything with developing that, I think they would need people who are polytheists to be doing that development. I don't trust us monotheists for that.
When we read verse 1, part of verse 1 is, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Now, I'm going to acknowledge right off the bat that this is a false binary, because I know if I don't, that Emily will. And it also happens to be true, which is fair enough.
Also, is this like puff pastry?
I don't know. I guess I'll have to eat more puff pastry to find out. Hey, actually, I think I love this plan.
You're welcome.
But yeah, you don't usually have a direct choice between love and knowledge, and those are your only two options, and you have to choose one. That's not usually how life works. However, in my life experience, I have noticed that having lots of knowledge can make a person feel like they are better than other people. Goodness knows there are plenty of fictional examples of this. There's an episode of Doctor Who coming to mind, but I'll keep moving. Because my real reference that I'm making for this point is that I've noticed also that having lots of love tends to make you feel more equal to other people than anything else. And that makes me think of Hufflepuffs, like me.
Of course it does.
I am not saying that all Ravenclaws are puffed up and feel like they're better than other people, because that is not true.
Right, you're just implying it.
Occasionally that happens.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately speaking, well, as a kid, I was kind of given the choice between love and knowledge in that I was good at the knowledge side of things. And when that happens, there are people who assume that you just suck at the whole, like, hanging out with people thing. At the whole
I know.
Having relationships with other people thing.
I was the good at knowledge person too.
Yeah. So that was the false binary that I was presented with, and everyone assumed I was on the knowledge side and therefore didn't really put a lot of effort into the relationship side, the love side, aside from my parents, who are awesome. But ultimately speaking, this is why I'm a Hufflepuff. If you give me a choice between two groups of people, one of them is filled with knowledge, and one of them are, like, kind and filled with love, and ask me, you can only hang out with one of these two groups, which one do you want? I will take the one that's filled with love. Those people are going to be more fun to hang out with, I promise. Like, the knowledge can be interesting and it's useful and all that, but there's more to things than just knowledge in terms of who you want to hang out with. Knowledge hopefully leads to wisdom, but not always.
Mm-hmm. So. Which begs the question, how did we get to be friends? I went the opposite route that you did. So I went the knowledge route and you went the love route. And now here we are.
Well, that doesn't mean I don't have knowledge, and that doesn't mean you don't have love. Because again, false binary, right?
Yeah. So. Talk about this false binary. But you're still holding it up.
Well, I'm still a Hufflepuff. You're still a Raven,
Gryffindor.
Gryffindor, yes, thank you. Ravendorf sounds a little weirder. I don't know.
Right. Gryffindor, yeah.
Ravendor is the version of a Gryffindor that is a big Edgar Allan Poe fan.
A what? Oh.
A big Edgar Allan Poe fan. The Raven at my door.
That's funny. When we get to verse 9, I have lots of feelings. So verse 9 says, "But take care that this liberty of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak." And I have had, personally, this passage used way out of context in the not causing anyone to stumble sense against me as a queer person. So I've had people who have said, well, I don't want to cause anyone to stumble. And that's their justification for not challenging bigotry and queerphobia.
Or, for that matter, enacting bigotry.
Or enacting, yeah. And I just, need to say that, in fact, that is the kind of stumbling that needs to happen. Bigots and queerphobes and racists need to stumble on that. They need their faith to be in contrast to that. And that is the kind of stumbling that we need more of, not less of. And that's not the kind of stumbling that Paul is talking about in this passage. In this passage, Paul is talking about people who are trying to figure things out and trying to figure out what makes sense for them and for their context and for their faith. The thing that Paul is talking about is the people who are just starting out and trying to figure things out, who need a little bit of reassurance, who need structure. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Who need some structure in their faith in order to have the freedom and the space to figure it out more deeply.
But that doesn't mean you don't figure it out more deeply.
Yeah, that's just like the beginning. We all need structure.
Right.
Our needs all change over time. But I think the thing that this reminded me of was in The Giver, where Jonas starts to realize all of this harm that is happening, right? Harm happening to babies that might not thrive, harm happening to people when they die, all that stuff. And that's the kind of stumbling that needs to happen also, right? People need to stumble over pain and sorrow because that's how you also stumble over joy and laughter. And so as Jonas is doing his own stumbling, then he becomes the catalyst for the whole community to stumble when he leaves the community and breaks open those memories.
Yeah. Actually, I was looking at a different verse 12, in which it says, "When you wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ." But I was actually thinking of a example of the good kind of stumbling, like you're talking about, for this verse. So there is a game called A Game for Good Christians, which I have played. And it's kind of like Apples to Apples, but it takes all of the weird, disturbing, incredibly violent, really bizarre verses of the Bible, and then you combine it with, like, different prompts. And usually that turns out hilarious. But it can also sound incredibly irreverent. But the thing is that when I played this, I was playing it with my husband and 2 other clergy people. My husband is not a clergy person, but he's a lifelong Christian.
And married to a clergy person.
Yes, so he gets some of this in ways other people don't. The thing is the reason why we particularly wanted to play this game was because those are the parts of the Bible that we spend our lives getting frustrated by and having to explain to other people and having to work with. And it's, like, we can't throw out the troublesome parts of the Bible, but sometimes we still want to. And as a fictional reference, I suppose, come to think of it, it reminded me, the reason we played this game reminds me of an episode of Doogie Howser. Wow, I'm old. And Doogie Howser goes to a field hospital in a very remote place and helps out for a while as a young kid who's a doctor because he's a genius. And he gets there and he finds out that the doctors are all, like, telling jokes and being silly while they do operations, and that freaks him out because he's a young doctor and he thinks everything should be horribly serious. And so they all kind of react and realize that, okay, maybe that's not the greatest thing to do to him. And then he realizes that the only way that they can get through the day is by making these jokes, because the work they're doing is incredibly hard. The next day, he tells a joke as well, and they all get back to doing what they were doing. And so there's a growth there, right? There's a maturing. And so that's the reason why we were playing this game, because sometimes you have to joke about these things in order to keep working with them, right? But the thing is that we made a mistake. We played this game in a restaurant. Surrounded by complete strangers. Which...
Pre-pandemic, to be clear, pre-pandemic.
Oh, yes, gracious. No, this was like 2 years ago now. And so, surrounded by complete strangers, and, on second thought, that was not the greatest plan. And we were approached by a very nice young lady from the next table who did not know that we were clergy. We did not bring that up, although one of my fellow clergy people did mention he went to church twice every week, which she didn't seem to notice. But moving on. She felt like we were treating the Bible with disrespect, and that bothered her. And she came over and she talked to us about it, and we had a very nice conversation. And then she left. And it wasn't that we were doing something wrong, but the thing is, we didn't explain to her why we were playing the game. We didn't explain to her about our reasons, and therefore our actions appeared much different than their substance, right? And so this is kind of what Paul actually is going for. We hurt her, and I don't want to make assumptions, but I got the feeling that she was maybe not a brand new convert to Christianity, but she was definitely going through like some kind of personal revival experience, which just from some of the language she used, which can be a wonderful thing to go through. And because we were in a very different place in our faith lives, our actions wound up causing her some emotional harm. And so that is the time when I learned not to play that game in public. So.
Yeah, I remember times when I've been with like queer clergy in particular, and we're being really snarky about queerphobia and stuff, and like saying things sarcastically. And there was one time where we were at a like conference center that's a progressive conference center, and we had at that point like one of the shirts for the group said fruitful and multiplying, because it was since 2009, but like there had been such an increase in queer clergy in the ELCA that we were like fruitful because fruits and that connection to queerness, and we were multiplying. There were so many of us, but like people who didn't know that would see it, and like somebody I think had mentioned and like wondering if it was like some sort of fertility thing.
Were you quiverful, basically?
Right. But then the like sarcasm and the snarkiness, like we didn't ever encounter anyone who specifically like said, hey, that's really bad, but we did have a moment where someone in our group was like, maybe we should tone it down a little bit while we're in the dining area with other people so that they don't think that we're queerphobes, which like anybody that knows me in seminary knows that I already have like been mislabeled that anyway. But
yeah, I may have had an incident in college when I accidentally convinced a room full of people that I was against female ordination, when that's what I was going for, because I didn't have a choice about which side of the debate to take. We all got assigned randomly. And the thing is that when I debate something, I get really into it, and it does not matter what side I'm on. And then I had to explain to the room full of people that, no, actually, I'm not against it.
I had to argue that Martin Luther... I had to do that in history class. I argued that Martin Luther's words led to the Holocaust, which I actually like think is true. But the person who like argued the no side was Missouri Synod Lutheran.
Woo.
And so we were like going back and forth, and then like the class had to vote, and like the reality is the class voted not based on the actual things that we said, because he didn't have any like evidence that I was wrong because I was right. But the class voted on like, we don't want to think about this like Christian leader as being bad, so we're gonna say no. It's like, it's not how this works, but okay. Speaking of advocating for things, in verse 13, Paul says, if food is a cause for other people's failing, I will never eat meat, so that I may not cause one of them to fall. And I'd just like to point out that Paul is advocating for vegetarianism. So, welcome everyone. Come to the vegetarian side. We have cheese.
I'm lactose intolerant.
You don't have to eat the cheese. I'll eat your cheese for you.
Our gospel reading for this episode is from Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 28. Jesus teaches at a synagogue and heals a man from an unclean spirit. Such authority surprises those present.
Speaking of authority, that's one of the themes that comes up in this passage. I know. What a surprise to all of us present.
And Emily accuses me of taking things too literally.
That was so good. We don't frequently get those sorts of smooth transitions, so I have to disrupt them with laughter. So I was thinking about authority, and there's lots of places where people have like some authority, but my immediate thought was like almost every sci-fi, fantasy, dystopia ever, all of the ones that I can like easily think of, have like the authorities, aka police or military, which is, super problematic because policing is racist and military is violent colonization. But this sort of authority that we're talking about with Jesus is not that kind of authority. It's not the like Pax Romana peace by threat of violence thing.
Yeah.
But it's more of an authority, like a professor, right? Where like you're very knowledgeable and you have expertise about what you're talking about. And it got me thinking about the authority of experience and the ways that I think, particularly for people with intersecting identities, with marginalized or oppressed or identities of oppression, the authority of experience is really important. That is a place of expertise and a place of authority, and not the tendency to white-splain or mansplain the answer that you Googled 5 seconds ago. But the authority, kind of like Laya in the Ember in the Ashes series that I'm, working my way through again, and so talking about all the time, who doesn't feel like she has the authority, and then gets to a point where she is the one with the authority. She owns and claims the authority of her experiences, the authority of her ancestry. All of that authority comes to her to say no or yes or this, or to make a speech, or to be that one like Jesus who speaks with this surprising authority, which is really cool.
Yeah. In verse 21, we hear that when the Sabbath came, Jesus entered the synagogue and taught. So, imagine if your place of worship let anyone who claimed to be a teacher show up and teach, without clearing them first. And one thing that people may not know, this actually happens. Clergy will occasionally get notes from random strangers saying, oh, by the way, I'm an authority on so-and-so, I'll be at your church at such a date, and I'll be able to teach your people about it. Not like a request, but a informing people. I have a colleague who once got an email from a 70-year-old guy who was really excited about coming to her church and reforming her youth group into, what it should be like. And she had to explain to him that no, she wasn't going to let him do that because she didn't know him at all.
Yeah.
So you can see how that would be weird. And the thing is that Jesus is Jesus, so Jesus gets to do this, But your average person on the street, not all people who show up randomly at your door and want to teach are going to be, Robin Williams' character from Dead Poets Society. Some of them might be more like Miss Trunchbull from the Matilda novel or movie. So you want to be careful about who you allow to teach your people.
I was thinking about that and thinking about the pulpit supply. Because I think it's more it seems more like pulpit supply to me, right? Where I will
possibly,
give the benefit of the
Fill
doubt
in for somebody on vacation
to someone who's on a pulpit supply list.
Because they've usually been checked at least a little. That's how we get those lists.
So, but that's similar to Jesus, right? He's considered a rabbi, and so could be on the pulpit supply list or whatever.
That might be true, yes.
So rural pulpit supply can be a little bit trickier than urban pulpit supply.
Oh yeah, and you get some interesting people on those lists too. I've had that.
One time I was getting pretty desperate, and usually I try to get pulpit supply who are people of color, whose first language is other than English, who are not men, and if I'm desperate, there was this one time where there was an older retired Episcopal man.
Yeah.
And I got him to come to the congregation, and he when I was talking to him about it, he was ready to come, and made some side comment that I was I don't know exactly what that's about, but this is next week and I have no other options, and who would ever talk about I know the readings for that Sunday, it's not going to come up. I think it's okay. I just need somebody to be there.
Yeah.
When I got back, the congregation was complaining about him because he had brought up when the Episcopal Church first started ordaining and acknowledging the ordinations of queer people, and multiple people in the room, multiple people talked to me about him and were yeah, he clearly didn't know his context, and because he had been saying that, and there were people who a couple of people who got up and took the kids out to the playground so that they didn't have to hear him speak. And a couple people who were if he had gone on for another minute, I would have stood up and left. And he had been covering for pulpit supply while I was at a Proclaim gathering for a bunch of queer Lutheran, like, rostered ministers and seminarians.
Yeah.
And so what I ended up doing was emailing him and saying, to just say thank you, like you do, and saying, thank you for filling in for me as a queer pastor. It's really important that I have time to be with us. And, like, really laying on thick the, like, you used my pulpit to say things that are harmful. Like, I didn't say that, but, like, because I knew that, I was like, here's how you're actually, both, like, supporting queer people right now. Thanks.
Yeah. That is the Midwestern thing to do. Congratulations.
Thanks. I don't speak Midwestern very well, so I was, like, real impressed with myself when I could, like, do that. It's because it was written, so I had time to, like, rework it, but...
That helps.
Yeah.
Moving on to verse 23. Just then there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. Now, this passage, much like our previous passage, has occasionally been used to hurt queer people. This passage and ones like it have been used to talk about people who have mental illnesses in some fairly terrifying ways. The Bible uses the phrase unclean spirit or things like that as a way of talking about mental illness, because they didn't, have modern psychology back then. They didn't know what was wrong with people. They didn't have modern medicine. They didn't have the context to understand what was really going on. That's what it looked like to them. And it has not always been helpful to people who are actually mentally ill, oddly enough. Much like in the book Jane Eyre, which I actually like that story a lot. I like the main character. But it mostly dismisses and ignores the crazy wife in the attic character, who plays a bit part and then causes the end of the novel. But there is also a novel called Wide Sargasso Sea, which was written in the 1960s, I think. And it explores the story from the point of view of the so-called crazy wife in the attic. And it expands on what things would have looked like from her point of view. And it's a really interesting reframing of the whole story, because it turns out that when you tell the story from the point of view of the person who is suffering, everything tends to look pretty different. So.
Yeah. I read The Wide Sargasso Sea a long time ago, I think, and I don't...
It is on my list, but so are a lot of things. So.
Gotcha.
But it sounds really interesting.
Yeah. I agree. I think there's a lot of caution that we need to have when we talk about mental illness and unclean spirits, and there are different ways that we can understand unclean spirits today, and so we'll probably do a deep dive perhaps this summer around that. Yeah. So keep your ears peeled, folks.
Ow, that's not
well, you can't keep your eyes peeled. It's a podcast. So in verse 24, the man with an unclean spirit cries out and says, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." And this is consistent with the idea that naming has power, and we'll see this some in our next episode as well. But the idea of naming Jesus in this case, of calling him the Holy One of God, is a way of, like, having power over him.
Yeah.
And Jesus, like, responds by silencing them. But it reminded me, and this, I was talking to River, who was on our last episode, about this, and she reminded me of the Shakespeare episode of Doctor Who, where the Doctor and Martha are in Shakespearean times and, like, get to meet Shakespeare and stuff. And there's so-called witches who are, like, trying to do, some pretty suboptimal things, as they say, some pretty evil things.
Right.
And the way that the Doctor actually, like, is able to defeat them, and the way that they lose their power, is when the Doctor names them as Carianites. And that naming, because the whole thing is about the power of words, and so that naming of them is part of how they win, how the Doctor and Martha and Shakespeare and all them win against the Carianites, who are not in fact witches, but aliens, like you do. So yes, naming has power. And at the end of this passage, in verse 28, we hear that at once Jesus' fame began to spread throughout the surrounding region of Galilee. And that reminded me of Katniss, of course, whose fame spreads very quickly after the reaping because she volunteers for Prim, her little sister, at the beginning of the Hunger Games. And that has basically never happened in District 12. And so her fame spreads, and particularly because she does it out of love for her sister, which is just not how most people experience the reaping. That's not how it works for so many people. Yeah, she becomes famous for that part, and then it spreads, and there's whole other things, and yeah, yay, fame, spreading. Except it's dangerous. For both Katniss and Jesus, actually.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 5th Sunday after Epiphany. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you appreciate what we do or want to get actual transcripts of the podcast episodes, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said, Pax vobiscum.